the Blitzscaling podcast. I'm Julian Newman. I'm joined by Aria Finger, who is Chief of Staff to Reid Hoffman, her current job. Aria has a very long and accomplished career before that as a CEO of a prominent nonprofit, a marketer, and a friend of many people are associated with our podcast, obviously Reid and Chris, but also Ben Kasnoka, who is an investor in my business. So anyways, welcome, Aria.
So lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
So how did you know Chris before becoming Reid's chief of staff, or did you meet him, in that context?
No, Chris is a new meet. So I met Chris through Reid, but has had many days and nights and meals talking about his trivia prowess since. So it's lovely to know him.
So we have like a ton of audience questions. And what I'm going to do here is encourage people who are watching this to submit questions. We have a question that's just submitted. I guess our audience is used to that. So you can just add them in the comments, either of whatever your platform you're using, YouTube, LinkedIn, and I will ask Aria your questions. If you're watching this as recorded afterwards, make sure to like and subscribe so that you can know when we're doing these interviews and have the opportunity to ask questions of people like Aria. But before we get into the questions, where did you grow up, Aria, and how did you get to this? Like, what is the journey that brought you to this kind of like magical Reid Hoffman adjacent life?
It is a magical place. I feel very lucky. The chief of staff job could be horrendous if you're the chief of staff of the wrong person. So I consider myself very lucky and grateful to be in this magical place with Reid, because Reid is truly fantastic. I grew up in the Bronx and then in Westchester. I'm like a lifelong New Yorker. Spent 4 years in St. Louis going to WashU, where I was an econ major. But for the rest of the time, I've been here in New York. I live in Brooklyn now. And I was always really passionate, like from a young age. I remember I gave a speech in history class when I was in 10th grade, and someone graffitied my locker with the word communist because I was arguing that there should be a maximum income, 40 times the minimum wage. But anyway, I was an econ major in school, and then I was just looking for a job, and I wanted to prove to sort of my econ classmates that nonprofits could be as efficient and effective as for-profits. And, I wanted to change the world. I wanted to do some good stuff. And I found my way to this tiny little nonprofit called Do Something. And it was all about mobilizing young people to take action on any issue, which I loved because passionate about education, passionate about equality, passionate about racism, passionate about criminal justice reform. It's like, how could I pick just one? And it turned out to be an incredible place to learn, to grow. I joined when it was just 5 people. I left as the CEO when we were 65 and a global organization of 5 million young people. So it was really an incredible trajectory, which I think gave me the skills to be really sort of active in a lot of different fields. We did politics, we gave grants, we vetted young social entrepreneurs, we activated folks. And so it was a really good training ground to be where I am today as Reid's chief of staff.
I actually watched a really old video on YouTube of you.
It's terrifying. Continue.
From I think when you were the CMO of Do Something. And you were talking about how to activate young people using, the internet and SMS and all the stuff that's like kind of like normal today. Right. But I assume it sounds like back then from the interview, people were just like really surprised that you would be doing this stuff. Have you found that a lot of the things that were applicable to, like the things that were kind of like young people or like specific when you were in that role have now become kind of like the normal thing for everything that you see?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's a lot of ways to future cast. People say that if you want to know what's happening in technology in 5 years, go to South Korea. Or if you want to see what's happening in politics, go to California because they set the blueprint. Or, Norway is leading the way on EVs. Or, what are the cultural trends that, millennials and Gen Z are doing? The Facebook was open to an EDU address. And then, 10 years later, Facebook was ubiquitous. So I definitely think that's true. Young people are early adopters. Young people also have no money. So they want something that's new and cheap and then eventually can be adopted by the broader culture. But yeah, SMS was one of those things. Do Something was one of the very first nonprofits or for-profits to use SMS for activation. At the time, we were Twilio's, I think, biggest or second biggest two-way communications customer out of like every company in the world because, we were texting back and forth with 2 or 3 million young people every Tuesday. So even though I was at a nonprofit, it was super fun to like be on the cutting edge of a lot of tech and a lot of specifically like using tech to activate folks, which was very cool.
So that brings me to where you are now. So you're chief of staff to Reid Hoffman. I mean, obviously, Reid does a lot of things. So he does, political work. He does nonprofit work. He does tech work. So the question is, what is your actual job? and then B, how did that, work in the nonprofit stuff and in kind of like what was at the time cutting edge, technology trends? How did that help you, get this job and also, perform and understand what's going on?
Sure. So, Reid's guiding light is how to improve humanity. He started out, he thought he was going to be an academic, he was going to be a philosopher, he wanted to talk about ideas. And he just sort of stumbled into the tech community when he realized that in order to, improve humanity the most, you needed to scale, you needed to blitz scale. And he didn't want to be writing theses for 50 people to read. And I sort of had that same trajectory. Like we were using technology to do something, not because technology was cool, but because it was the way that we could scale and make the most impact. And so in my current role, I'm here to help Reid do that. How can we make the most positive impact on humanity? And he does it across everything he's working in. So he does it in his investing, whether that's, investing in companies that he believes in that make people's lives better. Airbnb, giving people an income, giving people new travel experiences. He does that with his philanthropy. He's on a just horrifying number of nonprofit boards that he's really committed to, whether it's opportunity at work to help folks without college degrees get the jobs that they need because they have the skills, but not the, paper diploma. And then he does it through content. The reason why he writes books and hosts podcasts is because he wants to improve humanity and sort of lift up other folks in his network who deserve to be heard. And then the last thing is politics. And I'm sort of adjacent to politics, but Reid believes that democracy is critically important and it's under threat right now. And so those of us with power have the responsibility to uphold, the democracy of the United States.
So I'm going to segue into a plug for you, which is you have a podcast that you do with Reid.
Yes.
With super fancy guests, more fancy than we can get. But so I'm very jealous. But tell us a bit about that podcast and what you have learned as I don't think I think you're kind of like me where you've never done content of your own before. So what have you learned as a content creator or as a podcast host?
Sure. So I think you just called me a non-fancy guest. No big deal. I won't hold it against you.
No, you're our fanciest guest.
No, just kidding. Just kidding. No, the thank you for the plug. The podcast is called Possible, and it is all about sort of sketching out the brightest version of the future and how we can get there. And I think that's the critical part because people will say, oh, well, like that's really nice for you to dream these positive pie in the sky dreams that are never going to happen. But our point of view is that if you don't dream them, they will never happen. Everyone says you can't be what you can't see. And I think it also applies to the future. Like, we're going to predict the future because we're going to create it. And so how do we bring these incredible stories of positivity, but then also let's bring on guests who are doers and who are creators. Like, I see actually a real strong through line between my work at Do Something and the work at Possible, because it's not just about being like blindly optimistic. It's about interviewing people like Dr. Kim Budell, who has been working for 30 years to try to make fusion a reality at the Lawrence Livermore Lab. And she just oversaw the team that got fusion ignition for the first time in December. So she's not saying like, oh, I hope fusion happens. She's like, I'm creating it. And that's why I believe that if everything goes right and we have people believe, in the next 5 to 10 years, we can actually see fusion be something that happens, which is really incredible. And I feel that way about all our guests. Trevor Noah, he hosted a comedy show that was about all the horrible things that are happening in politics, but he has a truly optimistic point of view on the future and how we can get there. Brian Stevenson, he sees the horrors of the criminal justice system, and yet he still is hopeful and optimistic and feels like without hope, the opposite of hope is cynicism, and cynicism gets us nowhere. So the whole goal of the show was, how do we shine a light on these incredible people who are painting and actually sort of getting to this amazing optimistic future? And what I've learned is that podcasting is hard. Reid is such a pro. Like, I've done public speaking for years and years and years, but podcasting is a new form, and there's a lot of the tricks of the trade that I'm learning as we go. And it's always fun to learn a new skill. And it's always fun to be totally humble in your, hey, I'm not good at this yet, and I'm trying to get better. So the learning curve's been super fun.
Yeah, it's I'm discovering, I've never done anything like this before. As we were saying before getting on this, I'm doing this mostly as an excuse to spend time with Chris every week. And then part of what I like is I can just reach out to people like you who I don't know and be like,
Totally.
hey, and you'll come on, then I can meet you and talk
Let's
to you
hang.
and have actual conversations. And then I also, I found at least the format that we have been using, which is like, I think you guys are like more produced than we are. Like we were a bit more produced at first, and then we kind of leaned into like the heavily kind of like Gen Z-ish, more raw
Totally. Sure.
approach. But what that's meant is I just invite my friends onto the podcast, awesome. And it's just like a way to hang out with them.
Totally. You'd be having the same conversation over coffee, but now you're letting anyone who wants in on the conversation, which is fun, which is really fun.
So, final thing about you that I'm sure everybody who's watching this is really curious about, at least for the next couple months, is OpenAI. So, obviously, ChatGPT is the thing in tech right now, and Reid was one of the founders of OpenAI. Reid's on the board of Microsoft, and Microsoft is now a huge investor in OpenAI, so presumably he's been involved that way too. So what is, like, I guess the thing that everyone's going to be curious about is, like, to what extent did you get kind of an insider's perspective into what was going on there? And yeah, maybe we can start with that.
Sure. So Reid was an early funder of OpenAI and is, great friends with Sam and Greg and Mira and the team. So it was fun to sort of get an insider's view of what was going on, and what that became actually was Reid's book, Impromptu, that he co-authored with GPT-4. And so our team got a little bit of early access to play with the tool ahead of time, which was super fun. And, we got to do all the ridiculous things that everyone does, from make poems to limericks to, mashups in the style of Shakespeare plus Taylor Swift. And so we got to do all the fun stuff, but then we also got to dream about what were the incredible possibilities for it. And like I said, this turned into Reid's book. Again, one of his theories of the case, which I subscribe to, is that you need like content can create change. And so for those who haven't been able to play with it or haven't had time or, you know, haven't had the experience, like how can we talk to people about the positive future that AI will bring along? And we really wanted to encompass that in a book that people could read. And we self-published so that, you know, we locked the manuscript 72 hours, 100 hours maybe before it could arrive at your doorstep. So you're reading something that's not, you know, locked 9 months ago, shipped, 9 months, 10 months, a year later. It feels very contemporary. And I think that's so necessary for the speed with which AI is moving. It's moving so quickly. Probably the book's, you know, going to be obsolete in just a few months.
Is that book still available free as a PDF?
Yep, absolutely. If folks want to buy it on Kindle, I think right now it's just 99 cents on Kindle.
Okay.
And you can also download it for free if you just want to read the PDF. So we wanted to make sure it was as accessible as possible.
There you go. Another plug. I guess not for you, but for Reid, which I don't know to what extent you consider yourself to be tied at the hip with Reid, but you may not know, as I removed it from my LinkedIn, that kind of is distracting. But in a past life in Canada, where I'm from, I worked in a political party, and I was, essentially I didn't have the chief of staff title. I was the COO of the party, of a political leader. So it was, very similar to a chief of staff job. I was essentially his chief of staff, but like partisan chief of staff. His actual chief of staff was the legislative side.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why I have a lot in common with Ben and why we get along so well.
Absolutely. What it's all about.
And also you're, the chief of staff role can be held by people of different levels of seniority. You're obviously super, super senior. Ben, when he was Reid's chief of staff, was very young.
He was 11 years old.
Yeah. And so was I. I dropped out, just like Ben, I dropped out of college to take on the COO role at this large party in Canada. So, really my formative years. So when people were in college, what I was doing was essentially your job, right? And my entire identity got subsumed or essentially became synonymous with this other person.
Yeah.
Just such a strange way to live your life, I guess. To what extent is that the case for you, or do you consider yourself to be an independent person?
Well, I definitely consider myself to be an independent person. Well, it's funny. So when we were sort of dreaming up this podcast, we didn't know who Reid's co-host would be. And we were sort of going through potentials and, pitching them to Reid along with my coworker, Sean, who is the brains behind the podcast. And Reid said, "Oh, I thought the co-host would just be Aria." And I was like, "What?" And he said, we had made the number one bullet point for a co-host that this person has to be able to disagree with Reid. And Reid said to me, "Well, Aria, you disagree with me all the time." So I think part of a chief of staff's job is to sort of push back, speak truth to power, hold up a mirror. So hopefully I am still doing that. And I definitely consider myself to be an independent person. I have 3 kids. And so I love my job. I am, working all the time, but I also totally have a life. And I think that is really critical, to have friendships, family, whatever it might be outside your job.
Yeah, I definitely didn't have that when I worked in politics. That's also typical of political parties.
Totally.
So Luca just asked us a question. And so thank you, Luca, and everybody else who's watching, feel free, or you're highly encouraged to submit a question. Just add it to the comments and I'll run it by Aria. I think we've gotten so many questions that we'll end up only doing audience questions because Aria is that popular. But let's take Luca's question now. So I'm putting it here on screen. I haven't read it, but I will read it out. So it's a fascinating moment to be a chief of staff. I studied as well. My preferred chief of staff, Roseanne Badowski, and Debbie Bosinek, who's Warren Buffett's. And it says all roles are evolving at warp speed. So how do you feel about, I guess the question here, so Luca, thank you for, this comment, and maybe the question you can react to, Aria, is, what have you learned, or how do you think of the chief of staff role? And before I let you answer, I am going to thank Sharad, who just asked us another question, and Sharad, will get to your question right after.
Very cool. So the chief of staff role, I think, is the ultimate generalist role. So before I took this role, I didn't know anything really. I knew how to run a startup. I knew how to run a tech startup, but I didn't know how to be an investor. But I had to, spin up really fast. I didn't know much about AI. There's all sorts of things you're constantly learning. So in that way, it's sort of like being a consultant, because you're constantly spinning up on new things. And so I think sort of being intensely curious is critical, because you have to learn all these new things. But what I like about the chief of staff role is that you also get to do stuff. So often the sort of knock on consulting is you get to create these projects or whatever it might be, but then you have to hand it off. And I started a consulting firm within Do Something, which I really loved and was super fun. But sometimes you actually want to do the thing. And so that's what's fun about being a chief of staff is not always, but sometimes you have to do the thing, and there's always something to be done. And so I love that diversity, the something new every day. I felt like I had that at Do Something. I feel like I have it now. And so it's just super fun to be able to just train up all the time on new, cool, important stuff.
So we have Sharad's question I'm going to put here is actually pretty adjacent to this and good. So I'll jump into it immediately. So instead of having a follow-up. So Sharad says, there was an article I read saying that a chief of staff would make a great first hire, presumably for a startup, or let's assume it's for a startup because we are a startup podcast. And can you expand on why or why not that would be the case? So I'll let you answer.
So what you said earlier is true. Chief of staffs are so diverse. Like, they can truly be anything. They can be any level. They can be any job description. I had a chief of staff at Do Something, a totally beloved, kick-ass woman who had been in business development, who I pulled up and said, you're going to be an incredible chief of staff. So like, truly, you can have so many different skill sets. I think the reason why it would be the case is because a chief of staff in some ways is a lot like a COO. They're about getting things done. And so that's often a great person to have as a right hand to what you're doing. I think it all depends on the startup. How technical are you? How many engineers do you need? Like, what are you doing? But yeah, absolutely. I could see that. If you're starting a company, you want a co-founder, want someone's outside, someone's inside. And then really easy to have that partnership.
Yeah, one of the things you were saying, if I understood correctly, is that really the chief of staff job, at least in your case, is you're kind of like the eyes and ears of the principal, right? So you're out there collecting information, processing it, and bringing it in a process like post-processing to the principal, so that they can make decisions. So that's part of it. The other part of it is that and this is kind of like unique to the chief of staff, just like you are senior enough, like you are the CEO of a large organization, right? So like, if required and when required, you can go off and just do things on your own. Like you could, let's say one of the NGOs that Reid is on the board of, if that NGO, their CEO left and the whole thing collapsed, you could just step in and become the CEO for 6 months while they hire somebody else. Like, is that like a good high level description of at least your experience as a chief of staff?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to step in and run any NGOs that Reid's on the board of. But to your point, the great thing about Reid is he has just an enormous amount of trust. And so I feel so lucky to have that trust. So, if Reid can't make a meeting, he'll say, hey, Aria, can you go take this for me? Or, I'm super busy over the next 3 months, but this is critical. Can you step in? And so it's really nice to be able to have that trust from someone. And to your point, because you're working with someone super closely, you often are on the same page. And Reid often says, which is really nice to know, he's like, listen, if we're on the same page 80 to 90% of the time, just move. Because I'd rather us move quickly and at speed. And like, you'll make mistakes and you'll make a different decision than me, but it's worth the trade-off. And that gives you the flexibility to move. Where if I knew that Reid's philosophy was that I needed to be with him 100% of the time, it would be paralysis. Like, we couldn't get anything done because I'd have to go to him for all of these decisions. And so it's really important, I think, for a chief of staff and a principal to really understand what's that error rate that you're willing to deal with, because there's going to be errors all the time.
So Sharad has given us a comment we won't respond to, but I'll put it here on screen. Sharad says, when you're hyper creative and sales based, I can see a chief of staff putting everything together coherently. So thank you, Sharad. And Sharad now says, thank you, Julian. So there you go. But we have a question, other questions that are connected to what you were just saying here. So we have a question here from Jing Huang, who is a PhD research candidate, a research assistant at Yale. And she asks, what is the main thing that you learned from Reid Hoffman?
Oh my gosh. I learn from Reid all the time. I will give 2 things that I learned from him. The one, it might be sort of random, but he's just really kind. Like, he is a very kind person. And I think you often hear that, you have to be cutthroat to make it to the top. You have to be a jerk. You have to take no prisoners. And Reid is extremely competitive. He wants to have his businesses do well. He wants to all those things, but he's an incredibly kind person. And so I think that's a really amazing role model to have. And the second thing I would say is, he really does look at the world in a networked way. That's not a surprise to anyone. He's the founder of LinkedIn, but it really is a reflection of how he thinks. It's like, anytime he can't do a speaking engagement, well, who are the amazing people in our network that we can lift up to do it instead? Hey, you're actually his old chief of staff, Ben Kaznowka, posted on social media last week. If you could only either interview a candidate or interview someone who had worked with them, who would you choose? And I don't know what Reid would choose, but he might just choose to interview the person who had worked with them, because the way his world works is, let's look at the network and what is the network intelligence? What is the network intelligence on future hires? If I need to know how to market a book, what is the network intelligence on marketing a book? Like, your network can be so much more than just job referrals. And watching him use his network that way is like a masterclass on how to do that. And I think that's also why he's so respected. He's done so many favors, helped so many people, lifted so many people up. So certainly something I aspire to.
I remember I use this thing, newsfeed eradicator, so I never see anybody's posts. But the only person who I make a point, well, the 2 people I make a point to go see their what they post on LinkedIn are Chris, Ye, and Ben.
Love it.
And so I did see that post, and I did read your comment on it, where you said that you would rather interview the colleague if they were a direct manager, I think is what you had said.
Or honestly a direct report. Either way, as long as they worked with them directly.
Yes. So, okay, you said something super interesting here, which is everyone thinks that business is cutthroat. And I think it's more than that. It's like everyone thinks that the world is about being, a jerk and being, out for yourself. Yeah. And that the people who are successful are like that. And I think, at least my impression is that most people's experience is that it's like that. So here's my question. It's like, why, like, is it like that? And why is it not like that for Reid? And how does Reid get away with being kind in a context where that's not what everybody does? At least their industries or people, nobody is like that, like entertainment famously.
Well, so I've been really lucky that I have just been surrounded, honestly, my whole professional life with people who have helped me, who have lifted me up, who have been kind to me, who have given me chances that I didn't deserve. And I understand that an enormous privilege comes with that. And so I certainly haven't seen the world that way. But I do think that when you're in shrinking industries, they can get more cutthroat. And when the pie is getting smaller, so the only way to win is to get your bigger piece of the pie, you're going to have to be cutthroat because that's the only way. But when you're in growing industries and when you decide to say that, like, we are not in a zero-sum game, everyone can win, it actually makes it so that you should cooperate. And I actually think that's some of the growth of Silicon Valley, is that because it was this tiny from a geography perspective, this tiny ecosystem where it was a multiplayer game. So I wasn't going to just play with you once and then never again. There was going to be multiple interactions. So you were incentivized to be good to people because otherwise you would be blackballed. And also that the pie was getting bigger. Famously, tech sort of started in Boston, in the Boston corridor.
Right,
and the reason it didn't take off the same way Silicon Valley did is because they had all the non-compete clauses that weren't letting people go and start businesses or take employees or whatever it might be, because they had this zero-sum idea. And in Silicon Valley, they said, no, actually getting the industry bigger will benefit each individual company too. And so I think that if we can all imagine that it's not a zero-sum game, then by definition, we will both be kinder, more cooperative, and we will grow the pie. And so I think that's one of the sort of secrets of Silicon Valley, people doing favors for each other. And it would be great to see that across the board.
It's interesting. I'm like, now I'm a bit older. I am turning 35 in 2 days. So
You're ancient, yeah.
I am now, I'm going to officially be not young this weekend, which is a sad realization. But I guess one of the things I started doing is I value people who are more junior than me more than people who are more senior than me. So let's say when I was 20, I really, really cared about meeting, let's say, people like you, where it's like, oh my God, this person can make my career or really help me because they're so far ahead of me. That's how I would think back then. Now I care about people who are more junior than me that can join kind of my version of ReidCo, right, and give me leverage, right?
Yeah.
And just instinctively, it's not like a kind of rationalization, although I think that is the rational thing to do. Like, I just instinctively think that way. And I was thinking about this recently, which is the reason why I can think that way is that I am thinking 5 years ahead, essentially. Yeah. So I'm playing, like in tech, people say play long-term games, right? So I'm thinking 5 to 10 years ahead. So it's like, hey, I'm starting a new business. I actually should be building relationships now for the next business, like not this one, but the one afterwards. Like that's and maybe part of the, like, to link it back to what you were saying, like the reason why you can be kind and nice to people is because you believe that you can get value from them in 10 years, and it's worth investing now to get 100x more value in 10 years, and that's just being nice to people.
Well, I certainly hope that's not the only reason. That's like a real cynical take on it. Hopefully you also are just like, this 25-year-old is going to do amazing things for the world, and I want to support them and have them go out and do amazing things. So hopefully it can be a little self-interest and also just a little generosity, a little bit of both.
And then the other question I had was so you were saying Reid tends to like default to thinking in a networked manner, which is really just like, I think the way you described it was elevating people in his network, like people around him. So actually, the example you're giving of your podcast, Reid, it sounds like Reid's default was like, hey, I want to elevate Aria. Like that was
Sure.
what he wanted to do. And, it's the same thing, let's say with Chris and Ben, where it's like, hey, how can I help you start a fund? I
Yeah.
know one of the GPs at the general partners at Village Global, that's Ben Casnoca's fund, Ross Fubini, left and started his own fund. And Reid was, the first LP there. So he really,
Yeah.
like what you were describing, I think is like his mode of doing things,
Yeah.
across the board. Um, and how does he think about that? Like, why does he do that? I mean, obviously he likes doing it and it makes him feel good. But why does he, uh, why is that the thing that he does?
Well, first of all, I think there is you bet on people you know. So he worked with Ben Casnoca as his chief of staff, and Ben was fantastic. And so Reid said, well, I'm gonna bet on this guy. He's amazing. And I think, but a corollary to that, which Reid talks about a lot, is that most of our networks are homogenous. And so when you bet on people you know, you often bet on people who are the same race or the same gender or the same class. And I think, especially in the United States, which has horrific upward mobility, the American dream, I think, is just a total sham compared to so many other countries in our peer group. You need to ensure that you're going outside your own network and making your network more diverse, because otherwise you will just be, keeping up the inequities of the past. And so what we also try to do is make sure we were bringing new voices in. And so every time Reid, supports Ben Casnoca, someone he knows and works with, he's also supporting Sean Mendy at Concrete Rose, who's building a VC firm that's trying to find underrepresented founders and bringing them to the table and funding them and getting on board. And so we see that as part of it is like, not only let's use our network, but let's make our network bigger. So it doesn't just, sort of set in stone the inequities of the past.
Okay. Ryan Heafy, I think is how to pronounce his name, who's a sales coach, asked essentially the same question, but about AI. What did you learn from working with Reid about artificial intelligence?
So I have a naturally positive disposition, as I mentioned, but so does Reid. And so talking to Reid about AI just gets you pumped, just gets you so excited. And I think what Reid thinks about with AI, I think more than the rest of the conversation, is the whole world. So much of the AI conversation is about the United States. And I want to minimize the harms for the US. I want to maximize the positivity for the US. Absolutely. But when people talk about, oh, we're going to have AI tutors, the first sort of criticism is like, well, I'd rather have a real person tutor. I don't want an AI tutor. And it's like, well, that's really nice if you have $200 an hour to pay a high-priced SAT tutor for your kid. But we have billions of people in the world who right now cannot afford a tutor. And so giving them an AI tutor is incredible. There's many people in the US, of course, who do not get the education that they deserve. Even the folks who do have the fancy $200 tutor could probably better themselves by also having an AI tutor that understood them and can create lesson plans specifically for them and really customize. And so talking to Reid about AI, it's really lovely to hear about the incredible ways that AI can actually make the world a better place, both for the US, but also in a global context. And so that's been really fantastic.
Okay, so I was going to ask you something else about that, but we have one of our audience members asked a question that would take us deeper here. So Andy Dew, who's into decentralized finance, he says many people are concerned about AI replacing them and being out of work or taking a severe pay cut. what advice would you give to entrepreneurs to adapt to this rapidly evolving and disruptive technology? Before I let you answer, I'm going to do a shout out to either people who are listening live, so add your questions so I can ask Aria, or people who are listening recorded, which is subscribe and like this video so that you can pre-ask questions like Andy did. So, okay, Aria, what do you say to Andy?
So it is a scary time. ChatGPT came on the scene in late 2022, and now it has 100 million users. We just saw that Chegg's stock dropped because people were using ChatGPT instead of Chegg. We saw that Stack Overflow was seeing less traffic. They attribute it to ChatGPT. So it is an unbelievable time of rapid momentum. What I would say to entrepreneurs and to anyone is just twofold. One is use the tool. Like, it's obviously trite, but in the beginning, lawyers are not going to lose their jobs to AI. Lawyers are going to lose their jobs to lawyers who are using AI. So if you are the lawyer who is using AI, if you are the entrepreneur who is using AI, you will not be the one with a job loss because you will understand how to use the tool. And the second thing I would say is just let's think about how we can be best at things that only humans can do. It's like the real dream is right now, doctors spend 60, 70, 80% of their time on paperwork, on admin, on coding medical records. Academics, brilliant academics spend time writing grants. We want AI to take care of that so that doctors and academics and lawyers and home health aides and nurses can spend more time on being human. So if you should be working on your skills that only a human can do, a bedside manner, I think, is going to become even more important because that's going to be a critical skill for a doctor. So what are the skills that only humans can do? And so that we can use AI to have us become more human. Like, I would love for there to be, much more interaction with teachers. They don't have to spend time grading papers. They can actually just work with a child to give them the encouragement that they need and the face-to-face interaction. One, I would just become an expert in the tool. And two, I would become an expert at the things that AI cannot do and that only humans can.
So it's interesting. So I'm a software developer, engineer, whatever, right? And your job as a software developer is to Google things. Like, that really is your job.
Totally.
Like, that's 90% of your time. And I had never really thought about it in that way until ChatGPT, came along.
Yeah.
And it's really, really useful as a software developer because it's just a better Google, like better Google, it's a better search. And then the thing that I've always been really good at just finding things, like compared to my wife. Like, I can just Google things and find them.
You're a better prompt creator than your wife. And
Yeah.
so that's gonna do you well.
Yeah, that's it. And I never kind of connected the fact that I never kind of understood that the reason I was really good at Googling is because I was a software engineer. But that really is the reason that I do that day in, day out. And you can see how, let's say 50%, I don't build anything really myself anymore. I built the first version of our last business. But that's the last time I really built anything by a website. But you can see how, as a programmer, right, you would have 50% more time back if you could Google, 10x better.
Yes.
And then you kind of what do you do with that extra time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't know a single startup out there that wouldn't, love to have double the engineers that they have right now, and could, double their business or whatever it might be. So I think it's going to lead to enormous productivity gains. And I think those skills, to your point, are still going to be in hot demand because people are going to have to learn how to find things and, implement what they learned and integrate it into the code that they're already creating. Just going to be more critical than ever.
So we are not going to have time to run through all the questions. So you have a choice. choose your own adventure. I can, like, the questions seem to be mostly AI oriented and nonprofits versus startups or nonprofit adjacent. Which which questions do you want me to ask you most?
I'm an equal opportunity employer. Let's do one of each.
All right.
Everyone wants to hear about AI though. So if you have to choose AI.
I'll start with an AI one.
Okay.
So Christopher Scott, who's director of private government contracting at a private government contracting company. He says, what does Aria see as the eventual solution to bad actors using AI to attribute false or fake statements, media, and other material to public figures, such as politicians, presidential candidates, recording artists, and other people of massive influence?
So less about recording artists or actors. I think that's important. But one of the things I'm most worried about is the sort of misinformation, disinformation that's going to be happening with as AI gets better and it becomes weaponized for our political campaigns. One of the things I would say, though, is that even before AI arrived, we were sadly in like a post-truth world. In the 2016 and the 2020 election, we had outside foreign actors who were pretending to be part of Black Lives Matter communities on Facebook and creating Facebook groups that were the largest Black Lives Matter groups on Facebook, were created by foreign countries to infiltrate our elections. And that happened before AI happened. And that was people impersonating people using their influence. And that was just one example of a way that sort of truth and trust was lost in the United States. So I would almost say that we need AI to fight back against the trust that was already lost. Yes, it's going to get 100 times worse. Yes, we're going to have deep fakes of Joe Biden doing ridiculous things or whomever the candidates are, probably less in 24, more in 28. But I think this is a critical issue. And so we need to use AI to fight back against the lack of truth that was already happening. And then, of course, we need to be using the AI tools to fight back against the bad actors. I do think that there will be regulation on this front to sort of help us weed those out. But the transition is going to be really tough. The transition is going to be hard and messy, and no one's going to like it. But I do sort of feel that if we fight fire with fire, we can actually get to a better place on the other side.
Bill Frumberg, sales director at ZocDoc, says or asks, what does Aria feel is most similar between startups and nonprofits?
So I actually don't draw a distinction as much between for-profits and nonprofits. I think at Do Something, I felt like I was running a not-for-profit startup. We were growing every year. We were getting more employees. We were using technology. A third of our team was, data, product, or eng. And so I feel it was very similar to a for-profit startup, maybe with less resources. Whereas, if you are UNICEF or the Red Cross, you're probably a lot like Coca-Cola or a lot like GM. I think like big companies and big nonprofits have a lot in common, and sort of startup nonprofits and startup for-profits have a lot in common as well. And so the number one thing I'd say is that you needed employees who were okay with change, who were okay with things that move fast and, business plans you threw out the window and a technology being introduced tomorrow, and who could roll with that. And so I think both of those things happen at not-for-profits and for-profits, and probably in both ways. Again, unless you're super well funded, you're figuring out how to do more with less. You're wearing many hats. You're fighting fires as you go.
So Aria, thank you so much for coming on and doing this with us. Your life is so glamorous to so many people. Like, we have 2 unanswered questions about your job as a chief of staff. You have tons of questions about, Reid, about AI, about all these things that, like, it seems like everything that's really cool, you embody. So,
I'm very lucky.
Yeah. So I guess I am blessed to have the opportunity to bask in some of your coolness for an hour. So thank you for coming on, and thank you, to everybody who is listening to this, everyone who asked questions. Obviously, you have a million things you could be doing with your time, and we really appreciate you, spending an hour with us. Mostly, thank you to our team, Jeremy, Shlok, and Brendan, who make all this possible. And Aria, I will, we're 2 minutes out, so I will give you back your 2 minutes. It's 5 p.m. almost for you, so you'll be able to get back to your kids. But yeah, thanks for doing this.
Absolutely. Any friend of Chris EA's is a friend of mine, so happy to do it and great to meet you.
Okay, I'm going to hit end stream, but you'll have to stay on with me for a minute.
Yep.